Hi, everybody. This is Gad Saad for the Saad Truth. Today, I have a repeat guest and possibly the shortest time elapsed from one appearance to the next. Heather McDonald, how you doing?
I'm doing great. I didn't know that, God. I'm quite honored. Thank you.
I
It,
think
it
it was, I
actually
went,
seems like it's been a very long time, so I've been kind of a little bit melancholy and resentful, but I shouldn't have been, I guess.
I think it was January 2022 that you made your inaugural appearance, but let me reread for those of you who don't know Heather, the few people who don't know you. You're the Thomas W. Smith Fellow of the Manhattan Institute and a contributing editor of the Institute's City Journal. You're an attorney by training and a New York Times best-selling author. The book that we're going to be talking about today, that was released this year, is titled When Race Trumps Merit: How the Pursuit of Equity Sacrifices Excellence, Destroys Beauty, and Threatens Lives. So true. But some of your earlier books, let me just mention them very quickly. Some of them are anthologies, others are, straight books. The Burden of Bad Ideas: How Modern Intellectuals Misshape Our Society. Are Cops Racists? The Immigration Solution, co-authored with Victor Davis Hanson, who's been on this show, and Stephen Malenga. The War on Cops, and your previous book prior to this one, The Diversity Delusion. Did I cover all the key points from your bio? Do you want to add anything?
No, no, let's get on to it. It's too boring. Thank you.
Okay, so I guess maybe before we delve into the book, or maybe it's a good segue to your latest book, since we last spoke, January 2022, so it's about a year and 3 months, has the infestation of parasitic ideas gotten, worse, no difference, or it has improved? Where are we?
It's worse. I'm sure, God, you're seeing it as much as I am on a practically daily basis. There's some preposterous admission from an academic medical organization, a scientific organization, proclaiming itself racist, proclaiming science racist, mathematics racist, declaring that diversity is the path upwards. So I don't see much pushback. I guess the only bright light on the horizon is the willingness now of some politicians, such as led by Governor Ron DeSantis in Florida. And this is not intended as any kind of political pitch, but I just observe dispassionately that he actually is stepping up to the academic fiction machine and saying, we are not going to spend taxpayer dollars on this ridiculous idea that colleges need diversity bureaucracy in order to treat their minority students fairly. We're not going to fund that. We're not going to fund any university that has a diversity oath. So that's a good sign. But coming from the institutions themselves, I would say that the post George Floyd neuroses, mental, emotional, psychological breakdown continues apace.
Yeah, I mean, you're exactly right that I see it on a daily uh, basis. And of course, having written The Parasitic Mind, you'd think that somehow I'm immune to being surprised by the insanity. But every day I wake up and I see an email and I go, what the F? So I'll just give you a few examples. And, I usually try as a courtesy to not directly criticize my own university, just out of a sense of etiquette, even though, of course, they exhibit all of the parasitic nonsense that any other school would. If anything, Concordia, my university in Montreal, probably scores higher on the woke meter as compared to most schools. It's kind of woke central. Canada, of course, is scores very high on that woke meter. Quebec is not great, and then Montreal and my university are really not doing well. I just saw an alert that came out. I can't remember the exact amount, something like $123 million grant awarded to, I mean, the lead investigators from my university, but it's really a collection of schools, to indigenize artificial intelligence. Did you hear that, Heather? To indigenize artificial intelligence. I think I'm probably not smart enough to understand what that is. Maybe you could help me. Can you guess what it might mean?
Oh man, it means the end of artificial intelligence. It means like the end of Western civilization. There's never been a civilization like this that has declared that its most powerful principles that transcended human irrationality with the assumption that there is possible to have universal knowledge, the scientific method, that and computer reasoning, mathematical reasoning, that this is somehow flawed and racist and sexist and oppressive and genocidal. It's beyond belief. And so I assume what it means as a very crude matter is a whole lot of grant making going to people of I don't know what your phrase is, Native Canadian descent, to do indigenous math circles. We do that in the United States as well. The National Science Foundation, which has been just an absolute funder of crazy intersectionality, queer research for a long time now. It has funded indigenous Navajo math circles in the hope that pretending that there is any sort of comparability between Native American counting systems and what we have achieved in the European tradition of math, that will somehow propel the next, Abel Prize winner to be a Native American. So it's really probably just a spoil system.
Do you think, and of course, you get into all of these examples in your latest book, across many different domains, and classical music and medicine, and which that's kind of cool because it shows that there are no disciplinary boundaries or centers of excellence where the nonsense, somehow it's immune for the craziness to enter. Wherever there is merit-based systems, the parasitic ideas go in. But do you think that the people who support this, who promulgate this, let's say, take it in my ecosystem in the universities, and I'm asking you to speculate here, but let's try it. Do you think most of them in the deep recesses of their mind know that this is performative and they know it's bullshit? Or as the old saying goes, first I have to lie to myself before I lie to others. Do they actually internalize it and believe that we won't be able to make any advances with the human genome unless we indigenize the human genome?
I opt for the latter, God. I do think
Okay.
That there's simply a refusal to look at the facts of our world, which are these vast academic skills gaps that are the real reason why we don't have proportional representation in the United States of Blacks in meritocratic institutions, or in Canada of so-called Indigenous people in meritocratic institutions. They're so terrified of the persistence of those academic skills gaps that they have just an immediate, like, split second shutting down of any kind of possibility of the facts entering their worldview, and that they have actually do believe that ideas of merit or excellence are somehow simply products of white supremacy. But I get asked this a lot, and it is a question that raises itself again and again and again. As you say, like, every day one is shocked by the leaders of some of our most cherished, important institutions turning on those institutions, to accusing them of racism or sexism. And one always wonders, what are they seeing that I'm not seeing, or what are they not seeing that I'm seeing? It's just bizarre.
But I mean, that's why, right? I mean, not to toot the horn of my last book, but that's why I use the neuroparasitological model, right? Because it requires that framework to understand how otherwise high functioning human beings, and again, speaking in the context of the university ecosystems, these are educated people, these are people who are well read, these are people who supposedly have spent their lives to try to navigate through intellectual landscapes. For them to be this zombified, it could only be because it literally is ideological brainworms that are causing them to completely lose their ability to reason. Nothing else could explain it.
I know. And I actually like it because, well, I guess maybe this isn't the case. What I hope is that, let's look at law school faculties. So not your field, but close. I've never known a more IQ obsessed group of people than law school faculty. These guys are just obsessed with intellectual ranking. including left-wing professors. I remember in law school, one of the most radical of the critical legal studies guys that taught criminal law would get together with somebody from the Stanford Law Review, and they would rank all the students in the Facebook based on how smart they were. So I hope that somewhere in these left-wing institutions, it gnaws away at the faculty, the white males, the often Jewish white males who are there based on merit, to have to put up with mediocre colleagues who have been put on the faculty because of the trivialities of sex or race, who are doing just completely fatuous identity-based scholarship, like in the field of law, writing about the significance of braids as a Latina American. I'm talking about hair braids.
Yeah.
And, these personal anecdote stories that now we're supposed to think constitutes legal scholarship. I would hope that it galls them. I would hope that it galls those legacy New York Times editors and journalists, again, overwhelmingly Jewish white males who were at the Harvard Crimson or, Hasty Pudding Club, just fabulous journalists, when they also have their newsroom now populated by people who are diversity hires, that it just sickens them. But I fear that it doesn't. I fear, because of your intellectual brainworms, that they have internalized that there are two sets of standards, and what these diversity hires are doing with their pseudo scholarship that has been created simply in order to give them a chance of working their way up the tenure ladder, it should be judged by a completely different set of standards.
So I can't remember if I asked you this the last time you were on the show, and even if I did, it's worth revisiting, but I don't think I had. So one of the things that I study as a behavioral scientist, as a consumer and evolution psychologist, are individual differences, right? What are some predictors that might help me understand why this group of consumers might engage in behavior X, whereas this group of consumers behave in variable B? And of course, sometimes it might be, for example, personality traits, because personality traits is one of the fundamental ways by which we assort people. That's what makes us different. We both have two eyes, but we score very differently on a whole bunch of personality traits. So if I were to ask you to just speculate, what do you think might be some personality traits, unless you have other predictors, that might explain why you and I might be somehow immune to the brain worms, versus you're referring to the Jewish white males, but I don't. I mean, yes, I understand that link, but of course, the possibility of administrators and professors who have been parasitized is much greater than that. Are there a set of traits that you have kind of surmised might explain why Heather is not parasitized by all this bullshit, whereas all of her colleagues from her class at Stanford are? What is the predictor?
Well, first of all, let me just clarify. I'm not saying that Jewish males are particularly subject to brainwashing or misunderstanding their world. I'm simply saying that they are the legacy merit hires.
Right. Fair enough.
So they are no more prone to these brainworms than anybody else who's succeeded them, but they are clearly, let's just say, I mean, they're smart and they're competent, and they got where they were through hard work. So I'm not saying that they're
Got
more.
it.
I know I'm not going to speculate that, because I do know that the left would say the same about us. They would say, how can you be so blind to systemic racism? How can you possibly think that personal behavior and personal decision making is more responsible for the ongoing racial disparities that we see than the fact that the entire world is stacked against blacks? When you can see the disparities in mortgage lending or personal income, household income, these are clear, and so you are blind to the overwhelmingly obvious reasons why we should still continue declaring ourselves systemically racist. So I'm very conscious, and I always try and ask myself, the principles that I would say, would I apply them to the other side? How would they view me? So I don't know. I mean, I'll say about myself that what I feel is I can't stand idiocy. I've always been committed to meritocracy, even when I was a liberal by default. I was never fanatically political, but I just absorbed all the assumptions of the coastal elites through my elite education. But when the issue of meritocracy became more prominent in the 80s, when we became more aware of the ubiquity of racial preferences, it always rubbed me the wrong way. And I guess I don't know whether it's the question of guilt. I mean, I do remember I was in graduate school. I was at Yale in New Haven, Connecticut, and I brought back this beautiful Holdsworth bicycle from England that I loved. I always fall in love with my bicycles, and it was stolen from outside the Yale Law School. I'd had a chain and, a heavy lock and everything. And my view at the time was, well, it serves me right. Here I am, this privileged white girl that can afford a Holdsworth bicycle. And even though at that point in the 1980s, I was clueless about how big the disparities in urban crime were, I nevertheless had some hazy sense that it was probably stolen by some Black teenager in New Haven. And at that point, I just felt, because of my white guilt, I deserve this. I have no right to complain about this bicycle being stolen. So I'm just saying that I too have been prone and susceptible to collective white guilt. I'm over that at this point for sure. But I can say that I've always had an instinct for meritocracy, and what that stems from, I don't know.
So maybe I could answer my own question, and you can respond what you think of it. So, I mean, certainly there is a form of existential guilt that many of the super woke progressives experience, not unlike how you might suffer from survival guilt when the plane crashes, and what was so good about me that I survived, whereas the person right next to me through the vagaries of life died. So I think there's definitely kind of a psychoanalytic link that we could draw here between, why am I, a wealthy person who goes to Princeton and Cornell, whereas other people don't? It just rubs me. Now, to that point, and so in answering the question of what makes you and I different from the woke people, I think a strong sense of personhood. In Arabic, there is an expression, which I'll say in Arabic and then I'll translate, right? Shakhsiyya. Shakhsiyya means, there's no fissures in your personhood. You're strong. You present yourself to the world tall and proud. And I think that inoculates you against some of that existential guilt that we're talking about. Now, let me add two more, although I think the full story is a bit more complicated. I think that you may have heard of the psychometric scale called internal versus external locus of control. External locus of control is things happen to me because of the environment, because of God, because of it's written in the sky, because of white supremacy, because of toxic masculinity. So you ascribe things to the outside world. Someone who has internal locus of control, things happen to me. I did well on the exam because I'm smart and I studied hard. I did poorly on the exam because I sucked and I went out and partied, right? Now, what most people do is they attribute successes internally and attribute failures externally. I think what happens to a lot of these super bleeding heart, full empathetic, woke people is that they probably score high on external locus of control, at least for the people that they pat on the head, the victim class, right? They can't have not done well in not getting into Yale because they made personal choices that did not allow them to get into Yale. It must be some external evil boogeyman that led to that, right? And then one final point I'll add is, and this is very much within the wheelhouse of my academic work, where I look at the evolutionary roots of human behavior. I think many of the people in the academia ascribe to the tabula rasa view of the human mind. We're all born with empty minds, with equal potentiality, and it's only socialization, it's only the environment that then results in the outcome that we have. So the only reason why I didn't become Michael Jordan is because mom didn't hug me enough, or she did hug me too much. But it can't be because I was born with a genetic endowment that was lesser than Michael Jordan. That sounds wrong. That sounds unfair. So I think you put those together in a cocktail, and then you can show that the people who have those sets of mindsets are much more likely to believe in the non-meritocracy that you talk about in the book. What do you think of that story?
Well, I think your three factors are a range of things that are inherent,
Yeah.
and in fact, sort of what we're born with, psychological dispositions, then down the scale towards propositional features of the world. So I don't think anybody's born with a predisposition towards a tabula rasa idea of human potentiality, and we all have equal capacities that are developed or not depending on our environment. That to me is something that you would pick up from your environment. But the issue of your first one, the strong sense of personhood and no fissures in personhood, I mean, I would be interested if you approached people from the left on that and said, do you think this describes you? Would they agree with that? Again, like, I'm always trying to flip the tables and say, well, they may say the same thing about us. So would they acknowledge your analysis of them, that somehow conservatives have a stronger inherent sense of personhood and liberals don't? I doubt it. My guess is they would feel like they have just as unified a sense of personhood. As far as the internal and external locus of control, I think it's different. One's own sense of control, the progressive knee-jerk reaction is to deny personal responsibility and agency to the victim groups, but that's different than having one's own internal locus of control. I suspect that a lot of these left-wingers are fairly much self-starters and may be good at deferring gratification and working hard, but their worldview depends on saying that the victims and the people that they're worried about and they're terrified that the academic skills gaps are not going to close, and that there is something inherent about them, that they cannot be expected to have an internal locus of control, that they are completely the victims of their environment.
So it could be internal locus of control for me as a woke liberal, but when referencing the victim groups, then it becomes kind of an external locus of control by proxy. So for them, it's external, but for me, that's an interesting thing that could be tested empirically. Okay, now in your book, you go through the different domains where, you see race-based, metrics trumping meritocracy and so on. How did you choose those particular ones? Classical music, medicine. I'm sure that your list must have been much longer. You've got a list of 30 possible domains, but you got to bring them down to 10, 12. What was your mechanism for choosing the particular domains to cover in the book?
Well, actually, I think it's pretty synoptic. I don't know what's outside. You've got STEM on the one hand, you've got humanities, the arts and culture on the other, and then you've got law enforcement on the third. I'm sort of thinking, what falls outside of that? I don't know. It's I think that pretty much covers it. And I chose them because, I mean, to be perfectly frank, the STEM and medicine stuff is probably the thing that gets people, maybe one hopes, finally paying attention. If you can say, look, at you should have no confidence from here on out that if you're brought into an emergency room after a near lethal car crash, that the doctor coming through that door is there because of merit and not racial preferences. But it's also the sheer, you and I share the same amazement and astonishment that people who have dedicated their lives to science and medicine are so cowardly that they are willing to call those amazing traditions sexist and racist when they are not. The culture aspect is because it's so close to my heart. My life would be a wasteland without classical music and art and literature. So that's something that I'm just going to fight for tooth and nail. And then law enforcement is something I've been writing on for a long time, and we're living it. I mean, here, in American cities, especially since the post George Floyd race riots, the degree of public order breakdown and criminality that's come out is beyond belief. And it's also one of the areas where the degree of denial, of duplicity with regards to race is the most extreme. I mean, we are all living these incredible fictions that say that the threat to Black lives comes from whites or the police, which is absurd. Blacks are killing each other off at magnitudes higher rates. It's not whites killing them. It's not it's not police, it's Blacks. And yet we've got this melodramatic fictional narrative bathos of every time a Black child steps outside, his parents rightly worry that he'll be gunned down by a police officer or a white person. President Joe Biden embraces that fiction, and we all go along with it. It's another one of those stunning head scratchers, like you feel, God, when you get the latest missive from the American Psychological Association,
yeah.
Canadian Psychological Association, about the sexism of our psychological scales. I feel the same when I hear Black Lives Matter phoniness about caring about Black lives and the alleged threat to them, which is from whites. In fact, here's who's threatening whom. Blacks are threatening whites. That's the reality. 87% of all interracial violence between whites and blacks and whites and blacks and whites is committed by Blacks against whites. That's just the reality. The reality of anti-Asian hate crimes in the United States. The people who are beating up on these frail elderly Asians walking along a sidewalk, who are stomping on them, hanging them upside down. We're all supposed to pretend it's white supremacists. It's not. We've seen the videos. It's Blacks, and yet we all go along with these fictions. I'm sick of living in a fictional world.
Well, so I think you earlier you said, well, you have I don't know if you use the word allergic, but I'll put it in your mouth. You're allergic to idiocy, and I always say that I'm allergic to bullshit. There's actually a scale, by the way, that was developed a few years ago, a psychometric scale that measures susceptibility to succumb to bullshit. I mean, it's literally a scientific scale. But that speaks to my earlier point about having a strong sense of personhood. The reason why, as you said, people go along, because I've always argued that, cowardice should be added to the 7 deadly sins. Now, some would argue that, sloth or apathy already captures cowardice. But okay, we could debate those fine details. But the reality is that certainly the great majority of people, as a default value, are cowardly. Why? Because we are a social animal. We wish to remain within the cohesiveness of the group, and it takes a outlier level of courage to say, I'm not going along with it. I will not sacrifice truth in order to get along with everybody in the group. And now in academia, I'll speak for academia, and then you can take it wherever you want to go. I've always said, maybe you've even heard me say it, that when you select Navy SEALs, until recently, when we now have recruitment strategies using twerking drag queens to recruit in the Navy, but until recently, we used to pick Navy SEALs who are going to be brawny, who are larger than life, physical courage, and so on, right? That's why we choose those guys to be Team 6 members, right? Well, I've argued that academics should be chosen not only based on the fact that they have PhD from Stanford and Cornell, but they should be intellectual Navy SEALs. But the reality is, we specifically choose people to go into academia, or the ones who are interested in going to academia. I call them the invertebrate castrati, meaning that they don't have neither a spine nor gonads, irrespective of whether they're male or female or two-spirit or non-binary. So therefore, by definition, you could never attack those bad ideas within academia, since most of the people in academia, not only they are the ones who are originating, spawning those bad ideas, but they don't have the balls to speak out against it. And that's why, I mean, if I can speak about myself, it's very, very difficult for people to make sense of me in academia, right? I'm very outspoken. I walk as though I'm 84 feet tall, but that's what it takes. It's not just intellect. It takes a unique personhood to say, sorry, don't count me in your cool kids club. You're all full of shit.
Yeah, well, I would say there's two issues for somebody in most institutions. There's stigma, and then there's the fear of the loss of jobs. And I'm not going to be self-righteous about myself and claim any specific type of courage, because I happen to be in an institution where I'm at much less risk of getting fired because I counter liberal hegemony of ideas. And I don't know what I would do if I were in an environment where I risked being fired. And it's asking a lot of people. And I quote somebody at the end of the book, an oncologist in a medical academic environment, who has been ordered by the deputy director of the National Cancer Institute, along with every other member of the National Cancer Centers in the United States, to send in a, quote, more diverse group of nominees for this very prestigious grant to do cutting edge cancer research, not to send in more qualified, but to send in more diverse nominees. And I asked him, when are you guys going to stand up for your profession and the integrity of your research? And he said, we need our jobs. We want our jobs. We could stand up and be crushed and nothing would happen. I don't face that. So, but if the worst that can happen to you is stigma and being called a racist, then I would say, yes, it is reasonable. And I would hope to expect that somebody would stand up for what he sees as the truth. And I would hope that I would do so. But again, I would ask the liberals, they would see themselves as the intellectual Navy SEALs. I doubt whether they would cop to the accusation that they don't have intellectual courage. They think, they characterize everybody on the right as election deniers or COVID deniers or whatever. So it's very frustrating to try to figure out what is it that we could possibly agree with the other side, and then to start figuring out where we differ, and would they agree with our criticisms of them. I just doubt it. So again, I agree with you that I think it's apathetic not to look at the facts that explain our racial disparities, but I'm not going to claim any special, I don't know, superiority or virtue for the fact that I'm willing to do so.
Okay, well, you're not willing to judge, so let me judge on your behalf. I mean, you're being a bit charitable in that, oh, well, if had I been in an environment that was a bit more hostile, maybe I wouldn't have been courageous. I don't think you would have just sat quietly, because I think you would have felt inauthentic. So I understand that each person has to modulate their level of risk. And going back to Aristotle, he talked about the golden mean, right? And this is something that I pick up in my next book, where I talk about living the good life, everything in moderation. So Aristotle understood very well that a reckless soldier is not a good soldier, because he's going to die very quickly. He's going to become a martyr, and by exhibiting unnecessary bravery, you just hang yourself. On the other hand, if you're too cowardly, then that's also not it. So like most things in life, as I explain in the book, there is some sweet spot. And I don't think that most people that you are referencing have hit their sweet spot. They are way more on the cowardly end of so I understand there are real pragmatic realities. If I speak out, I be fired, then I lose my home and I have to feed my kids. But look, I do have tenure, but that's hardly the thing that stresses me the most. What stresses me more is the number of death threats that I receive. What stresses me more is having to file reports with the Montreal police, whereby when I go to the university, I have security that follows me. That seems a bit more serious than whether you lose your job at Budweiser or not. I started developing symptoms of I'm the most cool guy who can tackle anybody, I started developing anxiety symptoms. I mean, real anxiety, not I feel anxiety because I have an exam. I mean, real physiological. I had one panic attack where, for nothing, for no reason, out of the blue, I was going with my wife and kids to get rotisserie Peruvian chicken, and out of the blue, I started getting symptoms as though I was having a heart attack. They rushed me to the hospital, and then the attending physician, who turns out knew who I was, said, "No, you're just having a panic attack." So the idea that, let's give people a pass because the only threats that you face is losing your job, and most people can't afford that, therefore let's give them a pass. Baloney. The people who landed in Normandy had something more than losing their job. It was called losing their heads, yet they all said, "Hey, sign me up." So no, I'm not going to be charitable about that. The fact that I have tenure doesn't mean that I haven't suffered greatly. As you and I have discussed before, one of my desires has always been to return to Southern California. I know for a fact that several major universities would have wanted to hire me, and then it was sabotaged. I did lose there. I know for a fact that it's been 4 years since I held the highest level university-wide professorship, chaired professorship, which should be a no-brainer for someone with my CV to have. I know for a fact I will never have that renewed. It's been 4 years that I've been denied that. I know that my teaching load has increased because they're desperately trying to find a way for me to say I quit. So there are many, many ways by which we all bear a cost beyond just losing our job or not. So am I being too unfair?
No, you're not. And it riles me up inside to hear this. I just, it's a collective action problem. If everybody that understands that we are tearing down our civilization could at one moment unanimously say, stop, we refuse to live by these fictions, it would make a difference. Stop being terrified of being called a racist or a sexist. It absolutely, with enough courage, and that wouldn't take so much, just to stand up for what you know is true. It would tear this thing down in an instant. If people stopped being cowed by being called racist and said, "I'm sorry, I'm not racist, these are the facts."
Yeah.
These are the facts. You can't scare me with this any longer. I refuse to be the victim of the race hustle. It would end because they don't have reality on their side. But I propose some solutions at the end of the book, but it's very hard to overcome the individual sense of isolation. But yes, if we could gather these people, create some organization that would create strength in numbers, create cover to put the facts out there about the academic skills gap, which I do in the book, so people are armed to say, here's the reason why we do not have racial proportionality in this oncology lab, or in this Alzheimer's research lab, or in this Wall Street trading firm. It's not racism. It's not that we're discriminating against so-called underrepresented minorities. It's because they are not in the pipeline. We can have diversity or we can have meritocracy. We cannot have both, given this stage in our history. Any institution that tells you, "Oh, I'm going for diversity," is basically saying, I'm eviscerating standards and I'm implementing racial preferences. So the facts are there. You got to be armed with the facts, and then just say, to hell with this BS. I believe in Western civilization. I am not going to impugn it on these phony charges of systemic racism at this point. Now, I'm perfectly willing to admit that America's history was white supremacist. We were an apartheid state, but we are not that country today.
What do you think? I mean, in the parasitic mind, I offer some psychological explanations as to why there's this kind of orgiastic victimology narrative. In your view, so forgetting about the white liberals who are doing the victimology by proxy, what is it that causes the so-called marginalized groups to wallow in that victimology? And before you answer, so I think you already know my background, but for some of the folks who may not know, also my wife is also Lebanese. Her family also fled Lebanon because of the civil war. her grandparents fled the Armenian genocide. We fled Lebanon under imminent threat of execution as Lebanese Jews. My grandparents fled. So it's not 300 years ago something happened in Mississippi. I had to wear the really good running shoes and run really fast so that my head was not detached from the rest of my body. And yet I don't wallow in that victimology. It's part of who I am. I recognize it. I talk about it. It's an indelible part of who Saad is. But what makes me the person that I am is that I have overcome that, rather than saying, you owe me, I'm a victim. I'm not a victim. I was a victim and I've come. So what is it that makes some of these groups unable to do that, but rather, whether it be the indigenous folks or some of the narrative in the United States, it's almost as I'm a victim, therefore I am. How do we snap them out of that?
I know. I'm going to speak very, very bluntly, God. I am sick of hearing Black leaders say lower standards on our behalf. That's the claim again and again and again. If we're not doing as well on the SATs, on average, throughout the SATs. If we don't do as well on the law school admissions test, on average, again, there's individuals who do not conform to that average that are outperforming thousands of whites and Asians. Lower the LSATs or get rid of the LSATs on our behalf. If we don't do as well on the medical college admissions test, get rid of the MCATs on our behalf. How about for once you say we will meet the standards and we'll beat you at your own game, which is what Jews did. They were kept out of country clubs, out of banks, out of law firms, and they said, okay, we're going to beat you at your own game. We're going to become so good that you have to hire us if you want to have a competitive edge over your competitors. And it's extremely dispiriting to hear this reaffirmation of an acting white ideology from the inner city, which is that if you put out academic effort and actually take your textbooks home and study, you're acting white. If you put in effort, you're acting white. If you're not truant, you're acting white. This is a completely pathological cultural idea. And I don't know. I mean, it's not for me. I'm treading on very thin ice here because obviously I'm wildly vulnerable to the accusation of, well, you're speaking from a position of white privilege, but one can just speculate on some possible explanations, which is that it's seductive to be a victim, that our culture confers enormous benefits to being a victim. If you're a leader of a victim group, Shelby Steele at Hoover has long sort of limbed the codependency between guilty white liberals and Black hustlers, with the Black hustlers claiming victimhood, playing upon the moral guilt of liberal whites, and they both give each other meaning in life. But one also has to ask, and again, I'm going out on a limb here, whether the concerted embrace of victimhood stems from some fear that with barriers of segregation having been torn down, that we're not going to be able to come up to the same standards. I would say, give it a try, guys, and put in the effort in a way that is not being done as much as it should be now, and kick the traces out and just say, okay, we're on our own. We're gonna emulate as bourgeois values of personal responsibility and self-control and go as far as we can.
Well, and look, you probably have heard of this finding that basically says that one of the best predictors of likelihood of your children being successful is the number of books that are available in the parent's home, right? Well, that's not a genetic thing. That's not running through my DNA. That's not coded in the double, right? It's a behavioral pattern that causes me to become, more knowledgeable, right? Thomas Sowell, who last I checked was a Black man who wasn't born with the proverbial spoon in his mouth. I remember there's a story that he tells where he first discovers, that there's the New York Public Library. Have you heard him tell that story where some guy takes him, I can't remember if it's an uncle or someone, takes him to the library, and he realizes, oh my God, I can just get this card where I'm allowed to go into this place and just take out books and read. And guess what? Little Thomas Sowell becomes big, incredible Thomas Sowell. It didn't matter what skin you was, right? I tell another story in the parasitic mind. Forgive me if you've heard it, Heather, but maybe not. When I had finished my MBA, so I did an undergrad in math and computer science. It's relevant to the story. That's why I'm mentioning the bio. So I did an undergrad in mathematics and computer science. It doesn't get more theoretical and technical than that. Then I did an MBA with a mini thesis in operations research, which is an applied mathematics field. And I was then thinking about going on immediately for my PhD because I had always wanted to go into academia. One of my brothers, who at the time lived in Southern California, was trying to convince me to take a break after my MBA and maybe work with him for a couple of years, put on the proverbial suit, and then I can go back to my PhD. Well, when I returned to Montreal to see my parents, and my mother had caught wind that this might happen, she takes me to a side room, very, very concerned, and to the point of whether I might be leaving after my MBA to work with my brother. She said, you realize that if you leave now, people are going to talk about you. You will be considered a school dropout. So from my mother's standard of Jewish excellence, it was, you're going to bring shame to the family with an undergraduate in mathematics and an MBA. Do you want people to laugh at us that we have a dropout in the family? Now, it's not that, of course, I went on to do a PhD to please my mother, right? But that gives you a sense of the kind of values that are inculcated in the home. Now, compare that to a home where, as you said, if I study for tomorrow's logarithmic exam, I'm acting white. It doesn't take much of an explanation to understand which one's going to succeed and which one's going to fail.
Yes, absolutely. But God, I would say it's easy to say, well, just be more literate in your home, be more interested in intellectual matters, be more interested in reading, have more books. But the question is, what leads one to be that way and not be that way as parents? Obviously, intellectual capacity is spread across any given population in a bell curve, and most human beings probably are not particularly intellectually inclined. Thomas Sowell was, but that doesn't mean that he represents the average, or that you and I represent the average of our groups. So, we always talk about, yes, the number of words that children hear by the time they're 3 or whatever is another predictor, but you can't just tell that mother, talk to your child more. She may be talking to the maximum of her capacity. And it's not just a race thing. Obviously, there's the white underclass, the Appalachian meth heads, and I have a pair of them living underneath me in Irvine, and it's really quite eye-opening, I can tell you. But so, we're treading on very thin ice here, of whether there are certain inherited predilections towards certain types of activity that may be lying behind these cultures. So it's kind of a chicken and egg problem.
Well, although even if you were to concede, and I'm not sure one can, but let's say we would concede that there are inherent differences in predispositions, but for most human phenomena, as you know, it's an interaction between genes and the environment. So notwithstanding that we might start at different starting points, whatever that cause might be, then the culture can either ameliorate this or worsen it. And right. So Larry Elder and other leaders in the Black community have placed all their chips on father absence, right? That if only you improve on that metric, right? I think he quotes, in the 1950s, how many Black families were intact, husband, dual husband, father, mother, versus now it's a catastrophe. We are a biparental, sexually reproducing species. That's the default value. Children expect to have both parents. So if I think you probably only improved on that metric, you would see great improvement downstream, wouldn't you?
Oh, absolutely. And I've argued this myself. I'm going to argue against myself right now, but every opportunity I talk about the breakdown of the Black family is totally catastrophic. It is civilizational ending when you destroy the marriage norm and you say to young black or young boys, you can go and serially impregnate females, and we are not going to expect you as a society to support your child, to marry the mother of your child. You can just continue to serially impregnate, and that's the norm, and your mother will go get a government check. That guarantees that you've got a bunch of feral males running around. That having been said, it is easy to say, and it's not that we shouldn't be saying it, you've got to get married. It's hard to do. In the Black community, the relation between the sexes is very, very troubled. It is very toxic. If you listen to rap, gangster rap music, it gives you a little clue as to how males and females regard each other. So it would be great to knit the family back together, but again, we keep sort of having an infinite regress of what's the core problem here, and how do you overcome that. But I would love to have, right now we're at 71% of Black children are born to single parents, and often they have a mother that's engaged in multi-partner fertility, with fathers that are also engaged in multi-partner fertility, meaning they have children by different set of partners on both ends. It's an absolutely tragic situation.
Wow. I want to be mindful of time. We only have, I think, 6 minutes left. So I'll ask you one or two more questions. Most of the topics, if not all of the topics that you cover in your book, are thorny, right? It's, you know, are cops racist? The diversity delusion, the current book, When Race Trumps Merit, and so on. Do you ever foresee at some point writing a book on, you know, the history of German Baroque music, or are you somehow driven because of your allergy to bullshit to always be writing books where you weigh in to correct the official record? Is that just part of your makeup, your mindset in choosing what I'm going to write next? Or do you ever foresee going into new lands?
Oh, that's an absolutely perfect question. I struggle with this all the time. I sometimes think I just want to write about beauty. I'm sick of this. I can't stand it any longer. It is the nonsense is too overwhelming. I want to escape it. I want to go someplace where I don't have to feel like I have to fight what you say, the bullshit all the time. Then I have to say, I do write about beauty. I mean, I've done a lot of music reviews and art reviews that are relatively untouched by politics. It's actually the hardest thing to do, to try and find language to try and convey what I am feeling from a work of music or a work of literature. Is much harder than writing an agonistic piece that is trying to take down bullshit. There you've sort of got your facts out there. So I go back and forth, but yes, my goal in life initially was always to be a literature professor and to have that luxury of being able to wallow in the greatest works of human achievement. And then you feel inadequate to them, and can your critical language possibly match them? And then we of course had the rise of high theory, which proposed absurdly that the reader is more important than the author, and that, you know, we all got involved in generating this ridiculous language of deconstruction, and then that mutated into all sorts of worse nonsense in order to kind of maybe overcome our feelings of how can I possibly match the beauty of Renaissance pastoral poetry or the 19th century novel.
I was just going to say, just because you mentioned deconstructionism, if I'm not mistaken, the guru of deconstructionism, Jacques Derrida, is from UC Irvine at one point, if I'm not mistaken. And so if you're in Irvine, maybe you can wallow in the smell of his bullshit because you're in the general area. Are you currently in Irvine?
No, but I go back on May 20th. I cannot wait. I'm counting the days. Yes, UC Irvine was the first university that created a entire department of critical theory. Like, it just jettisoned any pretense that we're actually reading literature. We're just going to read each other, which is what they've been doing anyway, so they might as well make it official.
All right, well, let me plug the book one last time, and then I know you have to go. So, guys, When Race Trumps Merit, How the Pursuit of Equity Sacrifices Excellence, Destroys Beauty, and Threatens Lives. It's out now. Please go and check it out. Heather, come back anytime you'd like. It was too short. Such a great time seeing you again, and hopefully we can see each other in Southern California, where I'll be there later this summer.
Oh, do please contact me for sure, God. I would love that. And thank you for your great questions.
Thank you so much. Stay on the line. Cheers.